In this video I'm gonna talk about Linux gaming. We will mainly focus on the direct desktop market, however, we will also take a small look outside the desktop space too. Now let's start with one of the biggest and most obvious points. Who could guess it? It's the anti-cheat. To be specific, kernel level anti-cheat. First of all, I'm not a big fan of it, but realistically speaking, until AI isn't a reliable way of detecting cheaters, Kernel Anti-Cheat is probably one of the only ways to at least keep the game somewhat clean. A good example is CS2. CS2 doesn't use any kernel level anti-cheat, it currently has in some matches an early version of AI-based anti-cheat, WAGNet, where AI watches and detects cheaters in matches. From what I know, it's not fully implemented yet, probably takes a lot of data and time until it's ready. But one thing we can for sure say, CS2 has a lot of cheaters. Some players encounter more, some less, but on average the cheater rate is still pretty high. Now to be fair, CS2 is the type of game where cheating is more common than in other games, but still, you can clearly see there is a big cheater problem. So why do I mention CS2? Because CS2 runs on Linux natively. Valve is trying to push Linux gaming forward, which is a good thing, because guess what? All players using the same operating system, in this case Windows, creates a monopoly. And in Microsoft's case, a really bad monopoly. Microsoft introduces one bad feature after another, and users mostly don't have much choice, since most programs, and especially games, don't run natively under Linux. The keyword here is natively. There are ways to make even unsupported games run under Linux, namely with Proton. Proton is a tool for use with the Steam client, which allows games that are exclusive to Windows to run on the Linux operating system. It uses Wine to make this possible. Now you might have noticed that while a lot of games work fine with Proton, maybe with some little problems here and there are still a lot of issues with this approach. First, the obvious, it's still risky to give one company, in this case Valve, since by the way Proton is made by Valve, full control over Linux gaming. Even if on Valve's case, it's compared to others probably the best company you could pick. Second, all of Epic's own games and most games exclusive to the Epic Games Store obviously won't run. They don't want to make their own launcher useless. Third, most online competitive games like Rainbow Six Siege and Valorant don't run under Proton. Multiple reasons why, but one of them is because of cheaters. Now, before you get mad at me for saying cheaters, there is a reason why some games avoid Linux. You gotta understand it's kinda true, on Linux it's much easier to cheat, in theory, because of the way Linux works. Unlike Windows, where the kernel is closed source, everyone has more or less the same core system. Windows has tighter access control, and kernel level anti-cheat works better because of that. But that's not the case for Linux. You can't get the same level of kernel anti-cheat protection on Linux like you can on Windows. That's just a fact, and I say this as a big Linux fan. Not only is Linux not one system, there is a ton of different Linux distros, each slightly different. Most of them are open source, which means you could literally recompile the kernel yourself, make changes, bypass checks. Now you might say, but hey, there are some kernel anti-cheats on Linux that are documented to work. And I must sadly say, they are not on the same level as Windows ones. You can simply recompile Linux, add some bypasses in the code, and boom, anti-cheat gone. The only way to fix that would be if everybody agrees on using one kind of Linux that's not open source. And that goes against the entire idea of what Linux stands for. And even if we did that, who says that this closed Linux kernel wouldn't become just another Windows in 10 years? So yeah, kernel level anti-cheat is a big problem, but it's not the only one. Let's talk about performance under Linux. In the past, the few games that even worked under Linux had noticeably worse performance compared to Windows. And that might still be true in some cases, but there has been massive improvements. Proton told they can achieve nearly the same performance as Windows, maybe 5 to 15% lower FPS on average. Important, the percentage I just mentioned is heavily estimated, so don't take this too serious. Also in some games the performance is even better on Linux. So if we take the average, yeah, we are slightly behind, but compared to 10 years ago, huge progress, especially thanks to Valve. Now primarily Nvidia GPU seems to be on Linux still slightly slower. That's still somewhat true, even if it got way better than it used to be. But on AMD GPUs, the situation is much better. In some cases, Linux kernel scheduler and memory management can outperform Windows in gaming workloads. Let's show some numbers here. Benchmark shows a 7% average performance deficit for Linux in some games, which is super impressive considering Proton is translating Windows-specific files in real time in order to make the game even run under Linux, so that's pretty good for the start. Now let's move on the user experience and the ecosystem. This part has gotten a lot better. Tools like Steam's Big Picture mode or the Steam Deck's game mode give a console-like feel. Driver setup easier than ever. Most distros let you auto-install Nvidia drivers during setup. There are even gaming-focused Linux distros like Garada Linux, Nobara Project. These come with out-of-the-box tweaks for gaming. There is also software like Mango Hut for example, which gives you a performance overlay just like MSI Afterburner does on Windows. So in all fronts, if you want to call it like that, it goes into the right direction. Yeah, development here is still a bit slow, but at least it's moving forward. With all these tools you can get very close to a Windows gaming experience. Sure, there are still issues. Some games need launch options or community tweaks to fix bugs, something Windows users rarely deal with, but that's where the community shines. Subreddits like Linux Gaming for example have guides for almost everything. Also, game engines like Unreal Engine and Unity, basically the two biggest in the industry, support one-click export to Linux. Now I'm not a game developer in that sense, so I don't know how seamless that export really is. I'm sure there's still some stuff that needs to be slightly adjusted, but the point is, the support is there. The current landscape. Things are still not perfect, but they've gotten a lot better thanks to Valve efforts over the last 5 to 10 years. Back then only a few hundred well-known games had native Linux support, now thousands of Windows games are playable on Linux via Proton. By late 2021, ProtonDB reported that 80% of the top 100 Steam games were working on Linux, with minimal issues, a gold rating or better. This includes big titles like GTA 5, The Witcher 3 and many more. Now if you're asking what's a gold rating, I'm gonna explain it to you real quick. Gold means runs perfectly after some tweaks. Platinum, one rank higher than gold, means runs perfectly out of the box. So pretty impressive as you can see. Thanks to Valve and Proton, the future of Linux gaming might actually look pretty bright. Valve shows no sign of giving up on this, and it makes total sense. Valve is terrified of being completely dependent on Windows. And this stat proves it. 96.21% of all Steam users are on Windows. That's really bad for Valve in the long term. They must find a way to make Linux a somewhat competitive platform to reduce the dependency on Microsoft. So in that regard we are pretty safe. Valve will continue improving Proton, SteamOS and gaming on Linux. Of course, big AAA companies and Valve's competitors still won't bring their games to Linux. Why? Two big reasons. Kernel level anti-cheat doesn't work properly on Linux, or at least not in the same reliable way like under Windows, and the Linux market share among gamers is only around 2.3% and 4% among all users. The market share was among gamers 1% not long ago, so it's growing. But unless Linux hits 10% or more, I don't see that changing soon. Even if you use Windows, even if you are still on Windows and not planning to switch, maybe because a lot of software outside gaming doesn't support Linux, you should still want Linux to grow. Microsoft has not been very nice to users lately when it comes to Windows. Sure, they made some improvements, but overall, the direction has been mostly negative. Things like AI recall, taskbar filled with ads and useless news, tons of bloat. I could make a whole separate video just listing the weird and bad things Microsoft has done lately to Windows. So it's a good thing for everyone if Linux becomes a real competitor. Why? Because if Linux goes more mainstream, Windows is forced to improve. Because if Windows had real competitors in the first place, they couldn't afford to take one L after another. And who knows, maybe in 10-20 years if everything goes right, Windows might actually lose its currently dominance. Nothing is impossible. No, about macOS, I personally don't even wanna talk about that, it's more restricted than Windows. Outside of work stuff, I personally wouldn't touch macOS ever, but that's just my opinion. Alright, I hope you liked the video. If yes, leave a like and a sub, and see you next time.